Imagine walking into a doctor's office, hoping for help, only to be met with cold eyes, mocking laughter, and subtle smirks you're not sure you're imagining, until it gets worse. Imagine needing care, but being treated like a joke. Now imagine that same doctor, the one sneering at your chart, whispering behind your back, acting like he's above it all, suddenly freezing mid-sentence, eyes wide, as he realizes someone unexpected is watching. Someone powerful. Someone who can change everything. Sounds like a movie, right? But what if I told you this story is a lot closer to real life than most people are willing to admit? You clicked on this video because the title raised a question in your mind. And I promise you by the end of this story you'll have your answer. And not just that, you'll have a whole new perspective on what respect really looks like, and how the tables can turn in a way no one expects. Stay with me because this isn't just another story. It's a wake-up call dressed as drama, and it's about to hit home. Hey, I get it. You've probably seen a ton of videos with titles like this, and you're wondering, okay, is this just clickbait, or is something real going on here? Let me reassure you right now. This isn't one of those recycled scripts you've heard 100 times. This is a layered, emotional, and sometimes uncomfortable ride that reveals something about human nature, about judgment, and about the kind of arrogance that gets people in trouble when they least expect it. But here's what makes this story different. It's not just about watching karma unfold, though there is some very satisfying justice coming. It's about connecting the dots between how we treat people and what that says about us, especially when we think no one's watching. And before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever been underestimated? Mocked for something you couldn't control? Treated like you didn't matter? If you've ever been on the receiving end of that kind of disrespect, you're going to feel this story deep in your gut. And if you've never experienced that, then this story might just open your eyes in a whole new way. Our story takes place in a private clinic, the kind with slick floors, glowing screens, and a front desk that smells like sterile air and fresh coffee. Patients come and go. Some worried, some annoyed, most just hoping to get in and out without too much hassle. In this world, Dr. Brent Holloway reigns like a king in his white coat, sharp jawline, and that smug confidence that some people confuse for intelligence. He's not the kind of doctor who listens. He's the kind who lectures. Not the one who comforts. The one who chuckles to himself when a patient stutters or forgets a word. You know the type, he thinks his title gives him a license to judge. But the thing about people like Dr. Holloway is that they never think they're being watched. They never consider that maybe the person sitting across from them has a story too, and that story might carry more weight than their own. And to the patient, quiet, polite, maybe even a little awkward at first glance. Nothing flashy. Not the kind of person who demands attention. Just another name on the chart to Dr. Holloway. But there's something about this patient, something just under the surface, that doesn't quite match the picture. And while the doctor mocks, rolls his eyes, and acts like he's above it all, he doesn't realize there's a hidden camera rolling. Not a literal one, but the kind that life sets up when you least expect it. 'Cause the truth is, someone is watching. Someone important. And the next 10 minutes are going to flip this entire story upside down. And here's the kicker. You're going to see it unfold moment by moment, exactly how it happened. You'll see the mistake, the arrogance, the reveal, and the fallout. And when it hits hard. You're going to feel a rush of emotions, maybe even some anger, because yeah, it's hard to watch someone be treated like that. But trust me, stick around. Because this isn't just about payback or a twist ending. It's about understanding how easily we can be blinded by surface-level assumptions. It's about humility, power, and what happens when people forget the golden rule. And I promise, the moment Dr. Holloway realizes who this patient really is, you'll want to be right there, watching his face. Watching the shift, the silence, the stumble. You'll see everything, and it'll be worth every second. So grab a drink, settle in, and don't skip ahead. Because you're not just here to watch something, you're here to experience it. And trust me, you won't want to miss the moment everything changes. And just when you think the doctor's gone too far, just when his ego hits an all-time high, there's a knock at the door. And what happens next? Let's just say, it changes everything. Dr. Brent Holloway wasn't always the kind of man who snickered at patients behind a closed door. Or at least, that's what his colleagues used to believe. In fact, just a few years ago he had a reputation for being sharp, reliable, maybe even a bit charming in a detached, clinical way. He came from a well-connected family in Chicago's North Shore, attended an elite Ivy League school, and coasted through his residency with glowing reviews. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Maybe it was the relentless pressure to perform in the cutthroat world of private healthcare. Maybe it was the slow ego inflation from being constantly praised for his quick diagnoses and impressive academic record. Or maybe it was something more personal. Rumors had started to float around the hospital. Quiet, cautious whispers about a malpractice suit that never made it to court, an abrupt breakup with a fiancé who vanished from his life without explanation, and some late nights at exclusive bars where he was often seen with people whose names no one dared mention aloud. Nothing ever confirmed. Just enough smoke to suggest there had once been fire. But Dr. Holloway, he shrugged it all off. Kept walking like nothing ever stuck to him. The patient that walked into his office that afternoon didn't fit the mold of someone who could pose any sort of threat. She didn't look like a lawyer or a reporter or someone with an agenda. Her name was Melissa Green, at least that's what the intake form said, and she seemed almost too ordinary to notice. Mid-30s, a worn hoodie that might have once been navy blue, hair pulled back in a loose braid. She didn't say much during the first few minutes of the appointment, but she watched. Oh, she watched. Every flicker of his eyes, every dismissive tap of his pen, every joke he mumbled under his breath when she paused too long to answer his questions. He didn't notice. He rarely did. To him, patients were just time slots with symptoms. He'd gotten good at treating the disease, not the person. And if the person happened to be nervous or confused or didn't make eye contact, he'd label them non-compliant, close the chart and move on. But something about Melissa was different. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. As the visit went on, she began to drop small, seemingly harmless details. She mentioned working in systems, though she didn't clarify what that meant. She asked questions that seemed too precise, too technical for someone without a medical or data background. And once or twice, she paused for just a beat too long, as if weighing her words before releasing them.
Dr. Holloway barely noticed. He was too busy playing with the stylus on his tablet and cracking wise about Google diagnosing millennials. But if he'd been paying attention, he might have felt the tension building. Might have seen the way the nurse who brought her in hesitated at the door, the way the receptionist looked twice at the intake sheet after she left it on the counter. But Dr. Holloway was too used to being in control, too convinced that people like Melissa didn't matter. What he didn't know, what you're about to find out, is that Melissa wasn't just any patient. She hadn't just wandered into that office by coincidence. And she certainly wasn't there just for a physical. Behind that casual exterior was a mind trained to notice inconsistencies, to gather subtle tells, to track behavior over time. She was there for a reason, a purpose. But was it revenge? An investigation? Or something far more dangerous? That's the part that'll keep you guessing. As the hours unfolded after the appointment, strange things began to happen. The clinic's internal server flagged an unusual login from an unknown IP. A patient file disappeared, just one. Security footage for a specific hallway timestamp went blank. Someone left a voicemail on the clinic manager's phone using a distorted voice that warned, "He's done it again." No one knew what it meant at first. The staff tried to dismiss it as a prank or glitch. But then a second message came, this time with a name no one had mentioned in months. And just like that, the old rumors started to resurface. Quietly. Uncomfortably. And now here's where things get murkier. Was Melissa working alone? Or was she part of something bigger? Could she have been planted? There were people who had reason to target Holloway, ex-patients who had left bad reviews, families who had hinted at filing complaints, even co-workers who'd been on the receiving end of his sarcasm and power games. One particularly sharp nurse had once confided that she kept her own documentation outside the hospital system, just in case things ever blew up. Was Melissa connected to her? Or to that malpractice incident everyone pretended didn't happen? And what about the fiancé who disappeared? Was she still out there, watching from afar? All these questions began to swirl just beneath the surface, creating a storm that no one could quite name but everyone felt coming. The funny thing is, people like Holloway never think the past matters until it shows up in the present, and then it's too late. So now, you've got a doctor with a history he's tried to bury, a patient with a hidden agenda, and a clinic full of silent witnesses who suddenly don't know who they can trust. You've got security glitches, cryptic messages, and a growing sense that something is about to crack wide open. But the real question, the one you came here for, is still hanging in the air. Who is watching?
And why?
And just when the tension can't get any tighter, just when you start to think maybe it's all a coincidence, an innocent patient, a stressed-out doctor, a few random glitches, the security guard walks into the back office, pale and shaking, holding a badge that doesn't belong to any current employee. It was found near the staff-only entrance. No one knows how it got there. No one saw who left it. But one thing's clear. Someone's been inside. Watching. Waiting. And whatever they're planning next is already in motion. That badge, the one found near the staff-only entrance, wasn't just some lost piece of plastic. It belonged to someone who hadn't stepped foot in the clinic for over 8 months. Her name was Claire Donnelly, a former physician's assistant who had resigned under tense, quiet circumstances. Most people in the clinic had forgotten her, or at least pretended to. No one ever talked about why she left, but if you listen closely, you'd hear bits and pieces. A late-night argument in Holloway's office, a patient file she refused to alter, and a sudden email resignation with no explanation. Some said she'd taken a job out of state. Others whispered that she'd been silenced. But now her badge was here, clean, unscratched, recently used to access a door that had supposedly been off-limits since a software update months ago. The timestamp on the door's log didn't lie. Someone had been there. And whoever it was, they had access to areas not even the head nurse could open without clearance. That discovery should have triggered a lockdown, but instead, it triggered something far more unsettling: silence. Management didn't want it reported. The staff were told it was likely a glitch. But behind closed doors, people started locking their office drawers and watching their backs, just in case. Meanwhile, across town in a quiet, upscale condo complex, another layer of the mystery was just beginning to unfold. Jordan McAllister, Holloway's former med school roommate and now a practicing urologist at a competing clinic, arrived home to find a package on his doorstep with no return address. He wasn't expecting anything, not from Amazon, not from the hospital, not from anyone. But curiosity got the better of him. Inside the package was a black flash drive, no label, just taped to a folded piece of paper. The message was short. You defended him once. Don't do it again. Watch this before you speak. At first, Jordan laughed it off, assuming it was some elaborate prank or a phishing scam. But after scanning the drive in a secure environment, because like most doctors, he was no stranger to paranoid cybersecurity habits, he realized what he was looking at wasn't fake. It was footage. Clinic footage. Audio and video. Dates matched up with appointments Holloway had personally handled. And what it showed wasn't just unprofessional behavior. It was cruel. Systematic. Almost rehearsed. Patients being mocked once they left the room. Nurses being pressured to change reports. A pattern of manipulation and psychological intimidation. And it wasn't just one video. It was dozens. Each one worse than the last. Jordan felt a chill creep up his spine. He had always known Brent had a sharp tongue and a bloated ego. But this was a pattern of abuse, and it looked like someone had been collecting evidence for months, maybe longer. And that meant something even more dangerous. Someone had access. Someone who knew the clinic schedule, knew which files to pull, and had no fear about distributing that information to outside parties. But why Jordan? Why now? He hadn't spoken to Brent in over a year, not since an uncomfortable charity event where they exchanged forced smiles and left before dessert. But maybe that was the point. Maybe whoever sent the flash drive knew exactly who would be next to defend Holloway if things started to spiral, and they were making sure he stayed quiet. Back at the clinic, the unease had begun to bubble into quiet panic. 2 nurses called out sick. A janitor requested a transfer. The front desk staff started noticing unfamiliar cars parked across the street for hours at a time. Holloway, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of how deeply the walls were closing in. He thought Melissa was just another problem to be dismissed, another disgruntled patient fishing for a settlement. He had no idea that the dominoes were already falling behind the scenes, that the story he thought he controlled was already slipping out of his hands. And here's where the whole thing takes a turn. One of the internal auditors for the clinic's insurance provider, an independent contractor named Vanessa Rios, received an anonymous tip just days after the badge was found and the flash drive was delivered. It wasn't just a vague message or a dramatic warning. It was an encrypted file containing billing anomalies tied directly to Holloway's logins. Dozens of procedures coded incorrectly. Services billed but never performed. Patients listed who hadn't been in the clinic for over a year. The tipster hadn't just provided the data, they had annotated it, highlighting patterns that could only come from someone deep inside. And with it came a question typed at the bottom of the document. How much is silence worth to you? Now, Vanessa wasn't the kind of person to jump at conspiracy. She'd been in the industry long enough to know that most fraud claims led to dead ends or minor errors. But this wasn't minor. This was coordinated, layered, and dangerous. Someone was orchestrating a campaign to take Holloway down, and they were doing it methodically. But was it Melissa? Claire? Someone from Holloway's past? Or maybe a group of people who had been watching quietly, waiting for the right moment to pull the rug out from under him? The deeper you go into this story, the less certain anything becomes. Because here's the thing, everyone involved has a reason to want revenge, but they also have secrets of their own. Maybe Claire wasn't a whistleblower. Maybe she was involved and turned when things got risky. Maybe Jordan's not just an old friend. Maybe he's covering for something, buying time before someone else exposes him. And Vanessa? She's starting to wonder if she was chosen for this role, or if she was always part of someone else's plan. Because the more evidence she uncovers, the more she realizes that this isn't just about one bad doctor. It's about a system that enabled him and someone determined to burn the whole thing down from the inside out. And as the story unfolds, there's a growing sense that none of this is random. Every clue feels planted. Every witness seems too perfectly placed. It's almost as if someone is orchestrating the entire downfall like a performance, with each character being drawn deeper into a trap they didn't see coming. And yet, there's still one question no one has answered. Why now? And that question lingers, heavy and unresolved, as Holloway receives a single-line email from an address with no name, no history. You're being watched. Again. The email sent to Dr. Holloway, those 4 words, you're being watched. Again. Hit him like a slow, creeping chill that settled in his chest and wouldn't let go. For the first time, he couldn't laugh it off. Couldn't blame a nosy patient, a bitter ex-employee, or some online troll looking to stir chaos. This felt personal, intentional, like someone had been watching him not just recently, but for far longer than he'd ever realized. That single word, again, dug into his mind and refused to let go. It suggested a past surveillance, one he might not even have known about, and now that realization was beginning to unravel something dangerous inside him. He started digging through old messages, searching for patterns he had ignored, phone calls that ended too quickly, strange emails that once seemed like spam. And that's when he saw it. A single forwarded message, months old, buried in his inbox. The subject line was harmless. FYI, review this before Monday's meeting. He never opened it. He'd assumed it was clinic paperwork. But when he did now, his heart dropped. Inside was an embedded link, an archived internal audit, time-stamped 8 months prior. Attached to it was a note written in calm, clinical language. This is the beginning. You'll know when the end is near. And the signature? CD, Claire Donnelly. The moment Holloway realized that the first sign of this unraveling began right after Claire left, everything around him seemed to tilt sideways. But the twist? The real twist? It wasn't that Claire had been watching. It was that Claire had help, someone he never suspected. Someone still working at the clinic. Someone in his inner circle. Someone who had access to his schedule, his emails, his passwords. Someone he had trusted completely. And that someone was his office manager, Lyle. The quiet, efficient, glasses-wearing man who brought coffee precisely at 9:45 every morning. who stayed late when no one else would, who managed payroll, vendor contracts, and even his personal mail when Holloway was out of town. Lyle had been with him for 6 years. Never complained, never caused waves. But now, as Holloway cross-referenced login activity on his computer, the truth hit like a gut punch. Lyle had been copying his hard drive monthly. He had administrative access to every secure file. And what's worse, he'd been forwarding information to someone using an encrypted server hidden under a fake consulting firm domain. Still reeling from the discovery, Holloway confronted Lyle in the back hallway of the clinic after hours. The confrontation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Lyle looked him straight in the eye, calm and unreadable. And then he said something Holloway never expected. "You don't remember her, do you?" Holloway, confused and angry, demanded clarity. Lyle stepped closer. "You treated her like a case study. A number. A diagnosis that didn't matter. She was my sister." That name, Melissa Green. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was personal. Deeply, painfully personal. Melissa wasn't a real patient at all. She was an operative. Trained. Strategic. Not a spy in the dramatic sense, but a forensic data specialist who had worked with whistleblower firms to build cases against abusive professionals. And Lyle? He had been feeding her everything. Every file. Every video. Every time Holloway had rolled his eyes, cut corners, or whispered behind a patient's back, Lyle was watching. Not because he hated the doctor, but because he wanted him to see, to feel what it was like to be exposed. Vulnerable. On the other side of judgment. But here's the part that flips everything upside down. Lyle wasn't working with Claire. In fact, Claire had tried to stop him. She left the clinic when she found out what he was planning. She didn't resign out of fear. She resigned out of guilt. She didn't want the game to go that far. But Lyle? He had nothing left to lose. His sister, real name Elena, had once been a patient of Holloway's. Years ago. Quiet, anxious, struggling with early symptoms of a rare neurological disorder that Holloway dismissed as overreaction. She wasn't taken seriously. She was prescribed meds that made her worse. She lost her job. Eventually, she took her life. And when Lyle found her journal, he found page after page about a doctor who made her feel small, unworthy, and invisible. Holloway never even remembered her name. But Lyle never forgot. So now, everything you thought you knew? It's been flipped. This wasn't just about arrogance or a bad bedside manner. This was about a system that allowed it to happen again and again, until someone broke. And the most dangerous person in the building wasn't the doctor. It was the one standing silently beside him for years, collecting evidence, watching the collapse from the inside out. Lyle didn't need revenge. He wanted a reckoning. And now it's already begun. But just as Holloway begins to process this betrayal, just as he realizes how deep the deception goes, another message pings his phone, this time from an unknown number with an attached video. No name, no context, just a looping clip of him standing over a patient's chart, saying words he doesn't remember ever saying. Words that could end his career if they go public. And then, the final message appears. You thought the camera was in the hallway. You never checked your office. Now, nothing is safe. No one is who they seemed. And, the worst part? The real story might still be hiding just beneath the surface. The walls felt like they were closing in now, but not in the obvious, dramatic way you'd see in a courtroom drama or a hospital thriller. This was quieter, heavier, the kind of pressure that suffocates slowly and gets into your bones before you realize you're already past the point of escape. Dr. Brent Holloway sat in the dim office that once gave him a sense of authority and control, now barely lit by the soft blue glow of his monitor, which was looping that same damning video. Him, saying something cruel and dismissive, something that could be taken out of context, or worse, accurately represented who he'd become when no one was supposed to be watching. He didn't even remember saying it. That was the part that scared him most. Not the exposure, not the fallout, but the fact that this wasn't some deepfake or manipulated audio. It was real. He recognized the coat he was wearing, the clock behind him, even the patient's file in his hand. This had happened. And now someone else owned it. Someone who had taken their time, built a case from the inside, waited for the perfect moment to strike, and they were just getting started. The real punch to the gut came that evening when he received a call from Jordan McAllister, not just a former classmate, not just the man who had vouched for him during a messy board review years ago, but someone he once considered a brother. Jordan didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was flat, clipped, like he was barely holding something back. He told Brent that the medical board had been anonymously tipped off. The videos were already circulating internally. Some were time-stamped. Others blurred out patients' faces, but not his. There would be hearings, possibly even a formal investigation. But here's where the real twist hit. Jordan had also been contacted by the same source. He was given two options, both of which felt like traps. Either distance himself entirely from Brent, publicly condemn him, and hand over any communications or files they'd shared in the last 3 years, or stay silent and risk having his own clinic pulled into the growing web of suspicion. Jordan was angry, not just because his name was being dragged in, but because, in the middle of all this chaos, Brent hadn't told him the full truth. Not about Claire, not about Melissa, not about Lyle. And now, Jordan had 48 hours to make a decision that could either protect his own license or destroy Brent's career permanently. Brent tried to plead, tried to explain that he didn't know how deep it went, that he was being targeted, that this was bigger than just a few bad moments caught on tape, but Jordan didn't respond. The line went dead before he could finish. What made it worse was what happened next. Brent finally forced himself to confront Lyle, not in private this time, but in front of a witness, the clinic's compliance officer, a no-nonsense woman named Tanya Patel who had once defended Brent against a patient complaint that could have cost him his privileges. He thought maybe if someone else heard Lyle's admission, maybe if there was documentation, he could get ahead of this. But Lyle didn't crack. He didn't confess. Instead, he turned it around. Calmly, almost too calmly, he stated that Brent was making unfounded accusations out of desperation, that he had no proof, that if Brent wanted to escalate things, there would be legal consequences. Tanya stared at both of them, unsure who to believe, and that uncertainty lingered in the room like smoke. Because now Lyle had flipped the narrative. He'd made himself the calm one, the rational one, the victim of workplace hostility from a superior who was spiraling. And the worst part? Brent had no evidence to back anything up. All the files that might have helped his case were either wiped or locked behind firewalls he could no longer access. His credibility, once unquestioned, was cracking under pressure, and every move he made only seemed to push him further into the trap. Then came the ultimatum. Not from Jordan, not from Lyle, but from someone far more dangerous, Vanessa Rios. She had kept quiet for weeks, sorting through encrypted files, analyzing patterns, chasing the trail of insurance fraud and administrative misconduct. But now, she had reached her threshold. She called Brent directly, something she never would have done unless things were already past the point of no return. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was a fire beneath it, controlled, but deadly. She told him what she'd found. The patterns, the false claims, the suppressed patient reports. But she also told him something else, something that shattered the last illusion he had left. She had traced one of the server pings from the flash drive that had ended up in Jordan's hands, and it didn't come from inside the clinic. It came from Brent's home network, which meant someone had been there. Someone had used his Wi-Fi. Someone had accessed confidential material from his own space, under his nose, possibly for months. And Vanessa's voice, still cold, laid down the decision with brutal finality. Cooperate fully, sign a sworn affidavit accepting partial responsibility, and exposing whoever had helped him maintain the cover-up, whether knowingly or not, or face criminal charges that would not only end his career, but possibly land him in federal court. He had 24 hours. No extensions. No negotiations. Now Brent was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. If he named Lyle, he had to produce proof he no longer had. If he tried to pin anything on Claire, it would come across as retaliation. If he stayed silent, he would be seen as complicit. But if he accepted the deal and admitted guilt, even partially, he'd never work in medicine again. His name, his license, his reputation gone. And the deeper emotional weight came crashing down when he realized the one person he'd never considered through all of this, his daughter, Alyssa, would be the one to suffer. She was applying to colleges, most of which had strict codes about character references, family legal trouble, and public scrutiny. If this went public, her future would be stained by his choices. If he pushed back and lost, her name would be dragged through headlines he couldn't protect her from. So now Brent was no longer just trying to protect himself. He was trying to shield the one innocent person left in his life from a storm he had helped create. But the question haunting him now wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about how much he was willing to sacrifice, and whether telling the truth, finally, fully, was worth the destruction it would cause, or if the price of silence had just become too high. And still, somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching, waiting, recording, because the final play hadn't happened yet. And Brent wasn't the only one with something to lose. It all came crashing down in a single moment, a moment that should have felt like any other, just another Thursday morning. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not after the threats, the hidden files, the betrayals that stacked on top of each other like a house of cards just waiting for the right gust to blow everything into chaos. Dr. Brent Holloway barely slept the night before, eyes fixed on a tablet screen that kept blinking with new files, new emails, new footage sent anonymously. Everything pointed toward a conspiracy that was no longer just personal. It had roots far deeper than he ever imagined. What began as a single warning, a single flash drive, had now revealed a cancer spreading through the clinic and far beyond. And it wasn't just Lyle. It wasn't just Claire. It wasn't even just about him anymore. This was something else. Something far more coordinated. That morning, Vanessa Rios met him at a neutral location, a quiet co-working office downtown, sterile and quiet except for the low hum of printers and a flickering vending machine light. She didn't bring folders. She brought a laptop, a hard drive, and a second investigator. What she showed him flipped the entire narrative. The files recovered from the drive included more than just emails and recordings. There were spreadsheets, meticulously organized, with billing codes, patient records, and notes tracing back over 10 years. Patterns of insurance manipulation, overprescription of unnecessary treatments, falsified follow-up reports. And every one of them bore initials from staff members he had trusted with everything. His own signature was on many, not forged, his actual signature. Sometimes rubber-stamped by his own hand after a long shift, sometimes digitally signed on autopilot. And the scariest part was how easy it had been to get him to comply. Forms handed off during patient rounds. Papers slid under doors. Emails labeled urgent. He hadn't noticed because he hadn't looked. And now the evidence painted a damning picture. Not of one corrupt doctor, but of an entire system built on shortcuts and silence. But then came the real betrayal, the one that hit harder than all the rest. As Vanessa laid out the network of connections, Brent recognized one name on the payroll list that stopped him cold. Jordan McAllister, his oldest friend, his supposed ally. Listed as a strategic partner for a company called Veeler Integrated Health, an entity that had received over $600,000 in consulting fees from multiple practices, including Brent's clinic. Only Veeler didn't exist, not legally. It was a shell, a front for something much larger. Jordan wasn't just protecting himself. He had been orchestrating deals behind the scenes, leveraging Brent's clinic and others like it to inflate billing numbers and split the profits. What Brent thought was an old friend throwing him a lifeline had actually been a wolf quietly herding him toward the slaughter. Vanessa's team had traced the payments, the fake vendor accounts, even the offshore routing numbers. And worst of all, the entire thing had been hidden in plain sight. Hidden in Brent's own system. On company servers. Filed under operational services. Brent couldn't breathe. His hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from rage. Jordan had sat in his house, broken bread with his family, given Alyssa college advice, talked about legacy and ethics and trust, all while feeding on the very foundation Brent had built for years. He tried to deny it, tried to rationalize that maybe Jordan didn't know, maybe he was just a middleman, but Vanessa shut it down. He made himself a part of this, she said. And now you need to decide how far you're willing to go to bring it down. Because that was the point of no return. If Brent came clean now, if he handed over the names, the signatures, the approvals he'd never questioned, he could bring down not just his clinic, but 3 others in the state. Maybe more. He'd be a whistleblower, yes. But he'd also become a target. Every doctor, every board member, every administrator who looked the other way would come for him with lawsuits, counterclaims, media attacks. And yet, if he stayed silent, he would be complicit in the very system that had destroyed patients like Lyle's sister. He couldn't live with that. The pressure was overwhelming. The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Reporters were sniffing around now. A junior staffer had leaked an internal memo about ongoing concerns related to compliance. Patients were canceling appointments. Staff members were whispering in hallways. His daughter was pulled out of class by her school counselor after a local blog published a piece titled, "The Fall of Dr. Holloway." What did he know? The air felt electric with tension, every second dripping with consequences. And still, the people behind it all were smiling in meetings, shaking hands, presenting polished smiles for patients while shredding paper trails in back offices. That night, Brent made the hardest call of his life. He met Jordan in person on neutral ground, an upscale bar where they'd once toasted Brent's clinic expansion 3 years prior. Jordan smiled like nothing had changed, like the last few weeks were just a misunderstanding. But Brent was no longer blinded. He laid it out, piece by piece, the evidence, the timelines, the files. And Jordan's expression barely flickered. He leaned in, his voice low and measured, and said something Brent would never forget. "You were always the perfect face for the operation. Respected. Sharp. A little arrogant, sure, but people trusted you. And you let them." That's when it became clear. Jordan wasn't afraid. He had a plan. Contingency files. Alliances with legal teams and board members Brent didn't even know were involved. He wasn't running. He was prepared to sacrifice Brent if things got messy. Now it was war. And the conspiracy wasn't just about stolen money or manipulated data. It was about control. Influence. Entire networks of clinics operating like businesses first, healthcare second. Brent was just one cog in the machine. But now that he'd seen it, now that he knew what it really was, he couldn't unsee it. And whether he chose to burn it all down or walk away quietly, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. No matter what choice he made next, someone was going to bleed. It all built to this. Weeks of unraveling secrets, of losing sleep, of watching everything he had ever worked for turn to ash in his hands. Dr. Brent Holloway stood at the threshold of the hospital boardroom, heart pounding, the taste of betrayal thick in his throat, sweat clinging to the collar of his shirt, as if his own body knew something irreversible was about to happen. The board had convened a special meeting, officially to discuss leadership transitions and pending legal inquiries. But Brent knew better. This was a staged execution. A performance carefully designed by Jordan and the other silent architects of the conspiracy, using procedural language to mask an ambush. He had thought about walking away, about letting it all collapse behind him, but he couldn't. Not after what Vanessa showed him. Not after discovering just how deep the rot went. If he stayed silent, they'd keep operating in the shadows. If he fought and lost, he'd burn, but at least he'd do it knowing he tried. Inside the room, the air was cold with polished civility. Faces he once considered allies stared at him with forced neutrality. Some were scared. Others had already chosen a side. Jordan sat at the far end, calm and smooth, flipping through his notes like this was just another day. Brent didn't wait to be invited to speak. He walked directly to the head of the table, pulled a worn flash drive from his coat pocket, and plugged it into the board's presentation system. No theatrics. No preamble. Just video after video. Voice recordings. Patient testimonies. Billing records. Authentication logs. And then, the final piece, the smoking gun that Vanessa had dug out just hours before the meeting. A silent video feed, captured months ago from a dormant security camera in the lower records wing of the clinic, long believed to be decommissioned. In it, Jordan is seen entering after hours, carrying a file box, accessing confidential patient documents, and removing specific paper trails tied to Velar Integrated Health. The timestamp matched the exact night Brent's own audit trail had been erased. The room went quiet. Dead quiet. For the first time, Jordan didn't smile. He reached for his water glass with a trembling hand, and in that moment, the polished veneer cracked. Brent seized the opening. He laid out the timeline, not just of the fraud, but of how Jordan had built the shell company years earlier with the help of 2 other board members. How the insurance partners were complicit. How they had strategically installed Lyle into Brent's clinic not as a physician's assistant, but as a watchdog. A mole. There to keep tabs, to steer suspicions, to flag any potential whistleblowing activity early. Brent's clinic had been a test run. If it worked, and it did, they'd roll it out to half a dozen other private practices, all under the guise of administrative streamlining. All perfectly legal on the surface, but rotten underneath. It wasn't about healthcare. It was about control, profit, exploiting trust. Then came the moment that could have broken him, because just when Brent thought he had laid out every card, Jordan dropped his own. Calmly, without raising his voice, he revealed something Brent hadn't expected. A file. Not a video, not a transaction, but a document from years ago. A misdiagnosis. A critical one. From Brent. A decision that had led to a patient's death. A case Brent thought had been reviewed and cleared internally. But Jordan had held onto it, buried the details, and kept it as leverage. "You may think you're exposing me," Jordan said, his voice like acid, "but I've always been 2 steps ahead. The moment you make this public, that file becomes the headline. You'll be the doctor who killed a teenage girl with a rush diagnosis and buried it under paperwork. No context. No nuance. Just scandal." The room held its breath. Brent felt his heart thunder against his ribs. He remembered the girl, Emily Navarro. Her mother had cried in his arms after the verdict was read. Inconclusive. A tragic complication. Nothing anyone could have done. But Brent always knew there was something more he could have seen. Something he'd missed in the fatigue of a triple shift. He had buried that guilt so deep that even now, hearing her name felt like being punched in the lungs. But here was the impossible choice again. Protect himself by staying quiet, or expose the entire machine and accept the consequences, personal or not. So he made his choice. He turned to the board and said, without flinching, "Then release the file. If that's what it takes for people to see the truth, then let it destroy me. But not before it destroys you first." There was something in his voice, something stripped of fear, of ego, of defensiveness. And it shook the room, because Brent had nothing left to lose. And when a man has nothing left, he becomes dangerous. He becomes free. The board didn't vote that night. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Half the members walked out. Vanessa immediately forwarded the entire evidence dump to federal investigators and media outlets. Within hours, stories began flooding social feeds. Healthcare giant implicated in widespread billing fraud. Clinic network under federal scrutiny after whistleblowers' testimony. Velar Health, the silent empire behind your insurance claims. Jordan was named directly. So were 2 other executives. The dominoes started falling faster than anyone could have predicted. But the final twist? It came later that week, in a quiet, understated message delivered to Brent's private email from a domain he didn't recognize. No name, just a subject line. "You are never the only one watching." Attached was a single video clip, grainy but clear. It showed another figure, someone Brent hadn't seen in months. Claire. In a hospital room, sitting next to Emily Navarro's mother, handing her a file. A copy of the diagnosis. One that showed the error. One that proved Brent had made a mistake, but had tried to correct it immediately. It had been intercepted. Blocked. The report never made it to the internal review board. It wasn't just Brent's guilt that had been weaponized. It had been manipulated from the start. Claire hadn't betrayed him. She had been trying to help from the shadows, trying to protect the family, trying to get justice her own way. And someone had buried her too. Brent stared at the screen for a long time, pulse slowing, breath finally returning to normal. It wasn't over, not yet. But now, finally, the full picture was coming into focus. The storm didn't pass all at once. It unraveled in fragments, like a tight knot slowly loosening until the weight of it finally slipped free. In the days after the board meeting, the media circus reached a fever pitch. Headlines churned out updates almost hourly, turning Brent Holloway's name into a flashpoint of debate across trending hashtags like #MedicalWhistleBlower, #HealthcareCorruption, and #DoctorSpeaksOut. Some called him a hero. Others painted him as a scapegoat caught in his own arrogance. Talk shows invited former patients, legal analysts dissected every court filing, and social media split into factions, each interpreting his actions through their own lens. Brent didn't chase any of it. For the first time in years, he didn't care what the world thought. The truth was out. That was all that mattered. Federal investigators began pulling records from not just his clinic, but from dozens of facilities tied to Wheeler Health. Subpoenas followed. Arrests. Depositions. A sprawling web of corporate malpractice that stretched across 4 states started to collapse under its own weight. Jordan McAllister resigned from every board position and disappeared from public life overnight. Whispers said he fled to a property in South America. Others claimed he'd struck a private immunity deal in exchange for turning over the higher players behind the curtain. Brent didn't bother to confirm either rumor. There was no victory in chasing ghosts. Not anymore. The medical board launched its own inquiry into Brent's conduct, spurred by the resurfaced Emily Navarro case. But the evidence Claire had uncovered made a difference. The video she'd passed along was reviewed, authenticated, and confirmed that Brent had submitted the correction order before the fatal complication, but the record had been intercepted, rerouted to a third-party compliance handler that no longer existed on paper. Claire had known all along. She'd been working behind the scenes even after they'd stopped talking, risking everything to make sure someone still believed in the truth. She refused to come forward publicly. "Not everyone wants the spotlight," she texted once. "Some of us fight better in the quiet." That message, short and selfless, stuck with Brent more than all the noise on TV ever could. Patient testimonies, billing records, authentication logs. And then, the final piece, the smoking gun that Vanessa had dug out just hours before the meeting. A silent video feed, captured months ago from a dormant security camera in the lower records wing of the clinic, long believed to be decommissioned. In it, Jordan is seen entering after hours, carrying a file box, accessing confidential patient documents, and removing specific paper trails tied to Wheeler Integrated Health. The timestamp matched the exact night Brent's own audit trail had been erased. The room went quiet. Dead quiet. For the first time, Jordan didn't smile. He reached for his water glass with a trembling hand, and in that moment, the polished veneer cracked. Brent seized the opening. He laid out the timeline. Not just of the fraud, but of how Jordan had built the shell company years earlier with the help of 2 other board members. How the insurance partners were complicit. How they had strategically installed Lyle into Brent's clinic not as a physician's assistant, but as a watchdog. A mole. There to keep tabs, to steer suspicions, to flag any potential whistleblowing activity early. Brent's clinic had been a test run. If it worked, and it did, they'd roll it out to half a dozen other private practices, all under the guise of administrative streamlining. All perfectly legal on the surface, but rotten underneath. It wasn't about healthcare. It was about control, profit, exploiting trust. Then came the moment that could have broken him, because just when Brent thought he had laid out every card, Jordan dropped his own. Calmly, without raising his voice, he revealed something Brent hadn't expected. A file. Not a video, not a transaction, but a document from years ago. A misdiagnosis. A critical one. From Brent. A decision that had led to a patient's death. A case Brent thought had been reviewed and cleared internally. But Jordan had held on to it, buried the details, and kept it as leverage. "You may think you're exposing me," Jordan said, his voice like acid, "but I've always been 2 steps ahead. The moment you make this public, that file becomes the headline. You'll be the doctor who killed a teenage girl with a rushed diagnosis and buried it under paperwork. No context. No nuance. Just scandal." The room held its breath. Brent felt his heart thunder against his ribs. He remembered the girl, Emily Navarro. Her mother had cried in his arms after the verdict was read. Inconclusive. A tragic complication. Nothing anyone could have done. But Brent always knew there was something more he could have seen. Something he'd missed in the fatigue of a triple shift. He had buried that guilt so deep that even now, hearing her name felt like being punched in the lungs. But here was the impossible choice again. Protect himself by staying quiet, or expose the entire machine and accept the consequences, personal or not.
So he made his choice.
He turned to the board and said, without flinching, then release the file. If that's what it takes for people to see the truth, then let it destroy me. But not before it destroys you first. There was something in his voice, something stripped of fear, of ego, of defensiveness. And it shook the room, because Brent had nothing left to lose. And when a man has nothing left, he becomes dangerous. He becomes free. The board didn't vote that night. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Half the members walked out. Vanessa immediately forwarded the entire evidence dump to federal investigators and media outlets. Within hours, stories began flooding social feeds. Healthcare giant implicated in widespread billing fraud. Clinic network under federal scrutiny after whistleblower's testimony. Wheeler Health, the silent empire behind your insurance claims. Jordan was named directly. So were two other executives. The dominoes started falling faster than anyone could have predicted. But the final twist? It came later that week, in a quiet, understated message delivered to Brent's private email from a domain he didn't recognize. No name, just a subject line. You were never the only one watching. Attached was a single video clip, grainy but clear. It showed another figure, someone Brent hadn't seen in months, Claire, in a hospital room, sitting next to Emily Navarro's mother, handing her a file, a copy of the diagnosis, one that showed the error, one that proved Brent had made a mistake, but had tried to correct it immediately.
It had been intercepted, blocked.
The report never made it to the internal review board. It wasn't just Brent's guilt that had been weaponized, it had been manipulated from the start. Claire hadn't betrayed him. She had been trying to help from the shadows, trying to protect the family, trying to get justice her own way. And someone had buried her too. Brent stared at the screen for a long time, pulse slowing, breath finally returning to normal. It wasn't over, not yet. But now, finally, the full picture was coming into focus. The storm didn't pass all at once. It unraveled in fragments, like a tight knot slowly loosening until the weight of it finally slipped free. In the days after the board meeting, the media circus reached a fever pitch. Headlines churned out updates almost hourly, turning Brent Holloway's name into a flashpoint of debate across trending hashtags like #MedicalWhistleBlower, #HealthCare Corruption, and #DoctorSpeaksOut. Some called him a hero. Others painted him as a scapegoat caught in his own arrogance. Talk shows invited former patients, legal analysts dissected every court filing, and social media split into factions, each interpreting his actions through their own lens. Brent didn't chase any of it. For the first time in years, he didn't care what the world thought. The truth was out. That was all that mattered. Federal investigators began pulling records from not just his clinic, but from dozens of facilities tied to Wheeler Health. Subpoenas followed.
Arrests.
Depositions. A sprawling web of corporate malpractice that stretched across 4 states started to collapse under its own weight. Jordan McAllister resigned from every board position and disappeared from public life overnight. Whispers said he fled to a property in South America. Others claimed he'd struck a private immunity deal in exchange for turning over the higher players behind the curtain. Brent didn't bother to confirm either rumor. There was no victory in chasing ghosts. Not anymore. The medical board launched its own inquiry into Brent's conduct, spurred by the resurfaced Emily Navarro case. But the evidence Claire had uncovered made a difference. The video she'd passed along was reviewed, authenticated, and confirmed that Brent had submitted the correction order before the fatal complication, but the record had been intercepted, rerouted to a third-party compliance handler that no longer existed on paper. Claire had known all along. She'd been working behind the scenes even after they'd stopped talking, risking everything to make sure someone still believed in the truth. She refused to come forward publicly. "Not everyone wants the spotlight," she texted once. "Some of us fight better in the quiet." That message, short and selfless, stuck with Brent more than all the noise on TV ever could. Brent never returned to his old clinic. It shut down 6 weeks later, stripped of funding and legal backing. The staff scattered, some transferred, some resigned, and some spoke out on their own terms. Vanessa offered him a position consulting for an ethics reform panel being formed in D.C., but he declined. He didn't want to become a mascot for morality. He just wanted space to breathe again. Instead, he relocated to a quiet town in Vermont where no one recognized him on the street. He volunteered at a free clinic 3 days a week. No title, no plaques, just a simple ID badge with his first name printed in faded ink. For the first time in years, he felt useful again. Not important, not revered, just human. He still thought about Lyle sometimes, the broken young man who had first pulled back the curtain, intentionally or not. Brent had never seen him again after the clinic shut down, but one day an envelope arrived at the reception desk of the Vermont clinic. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photo. The note said, "She would have turned 18 last week. I just wanted to say thank you for finally making someone listen." The picture was of a small memorial bench in a city park, engraved with a name Brent would never forget, Marissa King, Lyle's sister. Brent didn't cry often anymore, but that day he did. Quietly. Alone. Because some things never stop hurting, no matter how many years pass. In the end, Brent didn't seek redemption. He didn't preach about reform. He lived quietly, did the work, and let the world move on around him. But the story never truly left. Journalists continued to trace threads that went deeper than anyone first realized. Congressional hearings started and stalled. Executives denied knowledge. Whistleblowers came forward in other states. And one afternoon, while reading a local paper over black coffee, Brent saw a small column buried in the corner. New investigations open into nationwide clinic network amid fraud allegations. The name Wheeler Health wasn't mentioned, but he recognized the pattern.
The design.
The quiet, familiar machinery still operating, just wearing a different mask. He folded the paper, took a breath, and looked out the window where a young girl in a bright yellow coat ran across the parking lot, laughing as her mother chased behind her. For a moment, the world felt light again. Not perfect, not safe, but honest. And maybe that was enough. Or maybe the story wasn't over. Not yet.